This week on the Retirement Quick Tips podcast, I'm talking about America's $36 trillion tab on the national debt and how that impacts you. What does it mean for Social Security, Medicare benefits, inflation, taxes, your investment portfolio? The unfortunate truth is that the growing debt problem potentially has a huge impact on all of these essential aspects of your life. So before we go any further, we need to clarify, what do I mean when I say the U.S. national debt? The national debt is the total amount of money that the U.S. federal government has borrowed to cover expenses that exceed its revenue in a given fiscal year. So to break this down a little bit further, there's a pretty good definition on fiscaldata.treasury.gov. And it says this: the national debt is the amount of money the federal government has borrowed to cover the outstanding balance of expenses incurred over time. So it's a cumulative thing that happens over time. So in a given fiscal year, they have spending. You have defense, you have outlays for Social Security, Medicare. There's a lot of spending that happens at the local and state level, but there's tons of government, federal government spending. They might have big road projects, etc. That spending for a very long time has exceeded revenue. In other words, the money that the federal government is spending on a bunch of stuff, a bunch of very expensive stuff, that exceeds what they bring in from federal income taxes and other federal taxes as well. So when this happens, you hear about a budget deficit. That's just simply in a given year, the money that was spent was more than the money that came in. And to pay for this deficit, the difference, the federal government has to borrow money. So they sell bonds to do that. There's treasury bonds. They have various like T-bills, which are shorter term bonds. If you've heard of Treasury Inflation Protection Securities or TIPS. So the government issues debt to cover that cost. So you can loan the government money and then they use that to fund the spending and all the projects and all the waste and fraud and everything else that DOGE was trying to address. The national debt is the accumulation of all of this borrowing, along with the interest that's owed to investors who purchased those debt securities issued by the government. So as the federal government has recurring deficits year after year, they're spending more than they're bringing in. That's why the national debt grows. And the debt just keeps on growing. In fact, it's not just growing, it is absolutely exploding. The national debt, if you go back and you look at a history chart of this, during World War II, it spiked. The national debt went straight up because they had to finance the war. But then, very importantly, the national debt dropped pretty quickly and fairly soon after. And so from about 1950 until the early 1980s, the national debt did not change very much at all. It didn't really grow. It kind of hovered for 30-ish years, right around $3 trillion. That's amazing because what that tells you is historically, it is possible to stop this path that we're on of increasing debt. Why? Because we've done it before and we can do it again. And we did it for a very long period of time. But then in the early 1980s, the debt started to climb again. And by the year 2000, the national debt was around $10 trillion. So it went up significantly the last 20 years of the 20th century. But since then, it has gone like real hockey stick, just straight up from 10 trillion at the turn of the century to now, fast forward 25 years later, we're at 37 trillion almost. It's at like 36.9 trillion right now. That is a six-fold increase in just the last 25 years alone. The problem is that over the last 40 years, you've had situations like we had the financial crisis in '08, we had COVID. The national debt absolutely exploded during this time because you could argue, and probably rightly so, that the government needed to spend enormous amounts of money just to keep things afloat, to keep the economy from going into a much deeper, darker depression during both COVID and back in 2008. But the problem is that there's no discipline in the federal government and there's no real strong motivation to dial things back. So the spending explodes and then, that's the new normal and we just keep on the path that we're on. And I'll talk a little bit more about that and why that is, but if you were a politician, if I was a politician, we would do exactly the same thing because if you don't take meaningful steps to dial back the spending, increase the revenue, which is really the only way that the US government is going to tackle the debt. Do you want to elect politicians who campaign on the fact that, hey, I'm going to cut all these things that you like. I'm going to cut Social Security. We're going to let the roads just potholes everywhere. And you know what? I'm going to increase your taxes right alongside with it. Nobody would get elected on that platform. And politicians who might step up and try those things while in office usually don't get reelected either. So this is a big, big problem. It's not something where we have a clear way out. And so I'm going to talk more tomorrow about why the US national debt is so problematic. We've been able to kind of chug along and, like I said, whistle past that graveyard for a long time. And now it seems that cracks are starting to emerge. This problem is going to potentially turn into a full-blown US debt crisis, perhaps sometime in the next 5, 10, 15 years. At least if we remain on the current trajectory we're on. So on that high note, that's it for today. Thanks for listening. My name is Ashley Michike, and this is the Retirement Quick Tips Podcast.